Before we get into this one, I need to ask you something. Have you ever touched a tree and felt like it was warm? Not sun warm. Warm like skin, like something with a pulse underneath the bark. If you have, drop a comment and tell me where. And if this is your first time here, subscribe. You're going to want to stick around for this one. A few months ago, a former ranger from Olympic National Park reached out to me. He'd been carrying this for 11 years, said he couldn't carry it alone anymore. This is what he told me. My name is Frederick Kelly. I spent 11 years as a forest ranger in Olympic National Park on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. I started when I was 26. I'm 37 now, and I left the service 14 months ago. I haven't been back. People ask me why I left. I tell them burnout, which is technically true. I am burned out. I'm burned through. But burnout implies the job wore me down slowly, the way water wears down stone. That's not what happened. What happened was specific, and it started on my 9th day in the Quinault Rainforest District, and it never stopped. It just got louder. Before Olympic, I spent 4 years doing trail maintenance and fire crew work in the Cascades. Before that, I did 2 years of forestry school at Oregon State and a summer internship with the Bureau of Land Management in Eastern Oregon, cataloging old-growth stands. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something. I wasn't some kid who wandered into the woods because he thought it would be romantic. I knew forests. I knew how trees grow, how they die, how they rot, how they feed the soil that grows the next generation. I understood mycorrhizal networks and nutrient cycling and the way a Douglas fir can live for 1,000 years if you leave it alone. Trees were my profession, my education, and for most of my life, my comfort. I don't find comfort in them anymore. I transferred to Olympic in March. The position was in the Quinault district, which covers the southwestern portion of the park, the rainforest section. If you've never been to the Quinault rainforest, it's hard to describe it in a way that doesn't sound like exaggeration. The trees are enormous. Sitka spruce that are 300 feet tall, western red cedars with trunks wider than cars. Everything is covered in moss, not just the trees, but the ground, the rocks, the fallen logs, the trail markers, everything. The air is so saturated with moisture that you can feel it settling on your skin within minutes of stepping out of your vehicle. It rains roughly 12 feet per year. 12 feet. The forest floor never fully dries. It's one of the most beautiful places on Earth. People come from all over the world to walk the trails and stand under the canopy and feel small. I loved it the first time I saw it. I genuinely did. The ranger I was replacing was a man named Dale Houston. He'd been in the Quinault district for 22 years, which is an unusually long posting. Most rangers rotate every 5 to 8 years. Dale had requested to stay every single time a transfer came up. When I asked him why during our initial meeting, he gave me a look I didn't understand at the time. A look that said the answer was more complicated than the question. "Somebody has to be here who knows," he said. I asked him what that meant. He told me to give it a week. Dale was 59 years old, lean, weathered, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood as the cedars he spent his life among. He spoke slowly and precisely, the way people do when they've learned that words matter more than most people think. He didn't waste them. In 22 years at Quinault, he'd probably spoken fewer words total than most people speak in a single year. He was also, I would learn, the loneliest person I'd ever met. My first week was orientation. Dale walked me through the trail systems, the backcountry access points, the equipment protocols, the radio frequencies, the emergency procedures. Standard stuff. I'd done it at 3 previous postings, but Dale added things to the orientation that weren't standard. On the 3rd day, we were driving the service road along the North Fork of the Quinault River. It was raining. It was always raining, and the wipers were on their slowest setting, clearing the windshield every few seconds. Dale was quiet, which was his default state. Then he pulled the truck over at a turnout I hadn't noticed before. There was no trailhead marker, no signage, just a gap in the undergrowth where the forest opened slightly. "You see that section in there?" he said, pointing through the windshield. I looked. Beyond the gap, the forest continued. It looked like every other part of the Quinault rainforest. Massive trees, thick moss, ferns growing from every surface. Maybe the trees were slightly closer together. Maybe the light was slightly different, but nothing I could have articulated as wrong. Looks like more forest, I said. Dale nodded slowly. Section 14 runs about 1.5 miles northeast to the ridgeline, half a mile southeast to the river bend, and about 3/4 mile northwest to the old survey marker near Irely Lake. You need to know its boundaries. Why? He reached into the center console and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, not ancient, but worn in the way paper gets when it's been handled hundreds of times. Folded and folded again until the creases are soft as fabric. He handed it to me. "Read it," he said. I unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but small. Multiple hands had contributed over the years. Different inks, different pressures, different styles. Some entries had been added in pencil, then traced over in pen, then annotated in a different pen. It was a living document. It looked like something that had been passed from person to person, each one adding what they'd learned. At the top, in the oldest handwriting, someone had written, Section 14, Protocols. Below that were numbered rules. Rule 1, do not cut, saw, chop, or otherwise damage any living tree within the boundaries of Section 14. This includes removing branches, stripping bark, or driving nails or bolts into trunks for any purpose. Rule 2, if a tree within Section 14 is damaged by storm, by animal, by any cause, and the wound produces a red or dark red substance resembling blood, do not touch it. Do not collect samples. Do not attempt to clean it. Leave the area within 10 minutes and do not return for at least 72 hours. Rule 3. Do not enter Section 14 after sunset. If you are inside Section 14 and the sun begins to set, leave immediately by the most direct route. Do not run. Walk at a steady, deliberate pace. Rule 4. If you hear a sound within Section 14 that resembles a human voice, but you cannot identify the speaker, do not respond. Do not investigate. Continue your patrol or exit the section. Rule 5. If you find a tree within Section 14 that has fallen across a trail or access route and the root system is exposed, do not approach the root ball. Reroute the trail. If rerouting is not possible, contact Dale before taking any action. That one had been crossed out and updated in fresher ink. Contact the senior ranger before taking any action. Rule 6. Between November and February, do not enter Section 14 alone under any circumstances. Pair with the senior ranger or another trained staff member who has been briefed on these protocols. Rule 7. If a visitor or civilian reports unusual phenomena within or near Section 14, sounds, sights, physical sensations, feelings of being watched, log the report under code RT-14. Do not explain the code. Do not discuss Section 14 protocols with civilians. Redirect them to other areas of the park. I read the list twice. Then I looked at Dale. "Is this a hazing thing?" I said. Dale didn't smile. He didn't look offended. He just looked at me with those pale gray eyes of his, the engine idling, the rain sliding down the windshield, and said, "Does it look like a hazing thing?" It didn't. Nothing about Dale looked like a joke. "What bleeds?" I asked, because that was the one that snagged in my mind. The trees bleed. Rule 2 described a red substance resembling blood. I had a degree in forestry. I knew about red sap, about oxidized resin, about fungal infections that could discolor the cambium layer. I had rational explanations ready. "The trees bleed," Dale said simply, like he was telling me it rained in the quinol, which it did, constantly. A fact of the environment. Trees don't bleed. These ones do. When they're cut. Red sap, fungal pigmentation, maybe a bacterial. Frederick. He said my name the way you'd say it to a child reaching for a stove. Firm, not angry, just certain. I've been here 22 years. I've seen it. I've had it tested. The lab in Seattle couldn't identify the substance, said it wasn't sap, said the cellular structure didn't match any known plant fluid, said it was most similar to... He stopped, picked up his coffee from the cup holder, took a sip, set it back down without drinking. "Most similar to what?" "Mammalian blood," he said. "Most similar to mammalian blood. They couldn't type it. They couldn't determine a species. They ran it 3 times, and each time the results were slightly different, like it was changing between tests. The lab asked where I got the sample. I told them it was from a drainage study. They didn't believe me, but they didn't push. I sat there in the truck, watching the rain, and I tried to reconcile what Dale was telling me with everything I knew about trees, about forests, about biology. It didn't reconcile, so I did what any rational person does when faced with information that doesn't fit their framework. I filed it away as something that probably had an explanation I hadn't found yet. That was the first mistake. Not a dangerous one. Just the beginning of a pattern of underestimation that would take me months to fully correct. Dale drove us back to the station. He didn't say anything else about Section 14 that day, but I noticed something as we pulled away from the turnout. The trees at the edge of that gap, the boundary of Section 14, were slightly different from their neighbors. Not in size or species, in posture. They leaned, not all in the same direction, the way wind-shaped trees lean. They leaned inward, toward each other, like they were closing a circle. I told myself it was root structure, soil composition, the angle of the slope. I told myself a lot of things in those first weeks. My first patrol of Section 14 was on day 9. Dale came with me. He was required to, per Rule 6, though it was March, not the November to February window. He told me no one enters Section 14 for the first time alone, regardless of the season. That was an unwritten rule. The paper didn't cover everything. Never does, he said when I pointed that out. The paper covers what we figured out. There's more we haven't. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast but not raining for once, which felt like a gift. The air temperature was around 48 degrees. I had my standard gear: radio, GPS, first aid kit, bear spray, field notebook. Dale carried the same, plus a small hatchet on his belt that he told me he'd never used inside Section 14 and never would. Then why carry it? I asked. In case something follows us out. We entered through the gap I'd seen from the truck. There was no formal trail, just a route that Dale had memorized over 2 decades of walking it. He moved through the undergrowth with the economy of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, stepping over roots and ducking under branches without looking. Inside Section 14, the forest was denser. That was the first thing I noticed. The canopy was thicker, letting less light through. The moss was heavier, hanging from branches in curtains rather than the thinner drapes I'd seen elsewhere. The ferns were taller, some of them shoulder height, which was unusual for sword ferns at this elevation. Everything was bigger, greener, more alive, and it was quiet, not silent. There's a difference. The Kino rainforest is never truly silent. There's always the sound of water dripping, of branches creaking, of small things moving in the undergrowth. But Section 14 was quiet in a way that felt selective, like certain sounds had been removed. I couldn't hear birds. In a temperate rainforest in March, you should hear winter wrens, varied thrushes, Pacific slope flycatchers beginning their spring vocalizations. I heard none of them. I mentioned it to Dale. He nodded. "They come in," he said. "You'll see them on the edges, but they don't stay. Nothing with a heartbeat stays in Section 14 longer than it has to. Except us." "Except us," he agreed. "And we shouldn't stay long either." We walked for about 30 minutes, following a rough loop that Dale used for patrols. He checked certain trees, specific ones, marked with small orange reflectors nailed into their bark decades ago by a previous ranger. He told me the reflectors were placed before the current protocols existed, before anyone understood what Section 14 was. "Nobody's driven a nail into these trees since 1987, he said, touching a reflector that was half swallowed by bark growth, the tree slowly consuming the foreign object. "We'd never do it now, but we use these as reference points." I counted 14 reflectors on that patrol, each one marking a tree that Dale checked visually, making notes in a small leather journal he carried in his breast pocket. He was looking for damage, he told me. Storm damage, animal damage, any wound in the bark. "And if I find one?" "You check the wound. If it's dry, if it looks like normal wood underneath, you log it and move on. If it's wet, if it's red, you follow Rule 2. "Have you found red ones?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, 11 times in 22 years. "What did you do?" "I left. I came back 72 hours later. Every time the wound had closed, sealed itself shut, new bark over the cut like it had been healing for months. in 72 hours. I knew enough about tree biology to know that was impossible. Bark regeneration takes months to years, depending on the species and severity of the wound. A significant wound closing in 72 hours suggested a growth rate that would be visible to the naked eye, like watching time-lapse photography in real time. "I know what you're thinking," Dale said. "I thought it too. I set up a camera once, trail cam, solar-powered, left it aimed at a fresh wound on a Sitka spruce. Storm had snapped a branch and the wound was bleeding." "What did the footage show?" Dale stopped walking. We were deep in section 14 now, surrounded by trunks the width of dining tables, the canopy so thick above us that it felt like being inside a cathedral whose ceiling was made of living things. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully managed distress. "The camera worked fine for the first 6 hours, normal footage. You could see the wound, the red substance dripping down the bark. Then, around hour 7, the footage started degrading. Static, frame drops. The timestamp jumped forward 3 hours in 1 second, and then there was a single clear frame, just one, between bursts of static that showed the wound had sealed. The bark was smooth, and about 15 feet behind the tree, in the background, out of focus." He paused. There was something standing there that hadn't been there before. Something. I couldn't make it out clearly. It was out of focus and it was dark, even though the timestamp said 2 in the afternoon. But it had a shape, vertical, tall, and it was facing the camera. "You still have the footage?" "The camera was dead when I went back. Not the battery, the camera itself. The housing was intact, no water damage, no physical damage, but the internal components had corroded. The tech at the visitor center said it looked like it had been exposed to decades of moisture, like it had been sitting in a swamp for 30 years. It had been deployed for 3 days. I wanted to see the SD card. Dale told me he'd tried to recover the data. The card was blank, not corrupted, blank, factory reset clean, as if it had never recorded anything. But he'd pulled that one clear frame before trying the card in his own computer, saved it as a screenshot on his personal laptop. He showed it to me that evening. It was grainy, low resolution. The trail camera had been mid-range at best, but you could see the tree. You could see the smooth bark where the wound had been, fresh and pale against the older bark surrounding it. And behind the tree, standing in the gap between 2 massive ferns, there was a shape. It was dark, not shadowed, dark, as if it absorbed the light around it rather than reflecting it. It was roughly the height and width of a person, but the proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't immediately specify. The limbs, if they were limbs, were too long for the torso, or the torso was too narrow for the limbs. It depended on how you looked at it, and every time I blinked and looked again, my sense of its proportions shifted, like my eyes couldn't agree on what they were seeing. It had no face, or it had a face that was the same texture and darkness as the rest of it. I couldn't tell, but it was oriented toward the camera with the specificity of something that was looking. "What is it?" I asked. Dale closed the laptop. "I don't know. In 22 years, I don't know. I know it's connected to Section 14. I know it's connected to the trees. I know it doesn't like it when they're damaged, and I know it's aware of us. Beyond that, I have theories. None of them are satisfying." That was the night I stopped filing things away as probably explainable. Not because the photo was definitive. It wasn't. It was blurry, ambiguous, the kind of image that a skeptic could dismiss as a shadow or a trick of forest geometry. But it was Dale's face when he showed it to me. 22 years of facing something he couldn't explain, and the expression wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. The deep marrow-level tiredness of someone who has been vigilant for so long that vigilance has become the same thing as living. I understood then why he hadn't transferred. It wasn't that he loved Kino so much he couldn't leave. It was that he couldn't leave Kino with someone who didn't know. The rest of March passed without incident. I learned the trail systems, memorized the Section 14 boundaries, got to know the seasonal staff who worked the visitor center and the front country campgrounds. None of them knew about Section 14, not the protocols anyway. A couple of the veterans, a maintenance worker named Terry and a volunteer trail builder named Gus, had their own quiet observations. Terry told me she didn't like working near the North Fork Road in the late afternoon because the light went wrong. Gus said he'd once found a set of boot prints on a trail in the Section 14 area that started in the middle of the path. No approach, no departure, just 6 prints in the mud, as if someone had materialized, taken 3 steps, and vanished. Neither of them asked questions. In my experience, the people who work in wild places for a long time develop an instinct for when not to investigate. They note the anomaly, they adjust their behavior. They don't go looking for the explanation because some part of them understands that the explanation is not something they want to find. April came. The rain continued, because the rain always continues in the Quinault. I settled into the rhythm of the job. Morning patrols, afternoon paperwork, evening radio checks with the district office. Dale and I developed a routine. We patrolled Section 14 together every Thursday morning. He was teaching me the landmarks, the reference trees, the subtle boundary markers that distinguished Section 14 from the surrounding forest. The boundary wasn't always obvious. There was no fence, no signage, no physical line. But there were indicators. The moss changed. It was darker inside Section 14, with a faintly reddish undertone that you could only see when you looked at it from certain angles. The air temperature dropped, usually by 3 to 4 degrees, which Dale attributed to the denser canopy blocking solar radiation. The ground felt different underfoot, softer, as if the soil had more give. And there was the silence. That selective, birdless quiet that settled over you the moment you crossed in. I started carrying a thermometer. A small digital one clipped to my pack strap. I logged temperatures on every patrol. Outside Section 14, 46 to 52 degrees, depending on the day. Inside Section 14, consistently 42 to 44 degrees, regardless of what the outside temperature was doing. A 6 to 8 degree differential that didn't correspond to elevation change or canopy density alone. I ran the numbers. The canopy coverage wasn't different enough to account for it. Something else was moderating the temperature inside Section 14, and I didn't know what. The thermometer was my way of coping. Measurement, data. If I could quantify the strangeness, I could contain it in a framework I understood. Dale watched me record my temperatures with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and pity. I measured things too, he said. First 5 years, I had a whole system. Temperatures, humidity, soil pH, ambient noise levels. I filled 3 notebooks with data. What did the data show? That Section 14 is consistently and measurably different from the surrounding forest in ways that have no satisfying explanation. You can document the anomaly. You can measure it to the decimal point, but measurement doesn't explain it. It just confirms that what you're feeling isn't in your head. He was right, but I kept measuring anyway. I think I needed the ritual more than the results. The first time I saw the blood was in late April, a Thursday patrol. Dale and I were making our usual loop through Section 14 when we came across a big leaf maple about 40 yards off the patrol route. It was a large specimen, maybe 80 feet tall, with a trunk diameter of about 3 feet. Something had damaged it. A branch had cracked, probably windload on a weak joint, and partially separated from the trunk, leaving a ragged wound about 4 feet up. Dale saw it before I did. He stopped walking so abruptly that I almost ran into his pack. "There," he said. I looked. The wound was fresh. The exposed wood was pale, the way fresh wood always is when the bark is torn away. But running down the trunk from the lower edge of the wound was a substance that was not sap. It was dark red, almost maroon. It moved down the bark the way blood moves, not the thin, resinous flow of sap, but with a thickness, a weight to it. It caught in the ridges of the bark and pooled in the moss at the base of the tree. Where it pooled, the moss was darker, matted, saturated. I took a step toward it. Dale's hand landed on my shoulder. Not rough, but firm, final. "Rule 2, he said. I stopped. I stared at the wound. The red substance was still flowing, slowly, the way a deep cut flows after the initial rush. It was viscous. In the gray light filtering through the canopy, it looked almost black where it was thickest. "That's not sap," I said. "No. What is it?" "I told you what the lab said." I stood there, 15 feet from a bleeding tree, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my first week on a fire crew, when a wind shift turned a controlled burn into a running crown fire. That feeling of reality tilting, of the ground rules changing beneath your feet while you're still standing on them. The forest around us was completely silent. Not the selective quiet I'd gotten used to in Section 14. Absolute silence, no dripping, no creaking, no wind in the canopy, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "We need to leave," Dale said. "Steady pace, back the way we came." We left. Dale walked in front, setting a pace that was brisk but controlled. I followed, resisting the urge to look back. It took us 12 minutes to reach the boundary of Section 14. The moment we crossed out, the sounds returned. Birds, water, wind. Like someone had unmuted the world. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I exhaled. Dale checked his watch. 9 minutes from observation to exit. That's within the window. Rule 2 said 10 minutes. We'd made it with 60 seconds to spare. "What happens if you stay longer than 10 minutes?" I asked. Dale was already walking toward the truck. He opened the driver's door, climbed in, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. "The ranger before me stayed 14 minutes once," he said finally. "A man named Paul Garrett. He'd been here 6 years, experienced, knew the rules. But this was a big wound, a cedar that had split during an ice storm, and the bleeding was extensive. Paul said he was documenting it, taking photos, sketching the flow pattern. He lost track of time." "What happened?" Dale started the engine. The wipers came on automatically, clearing rain that had already begun to accumulate. Paul said the silence got deeper, not quieter, deeper, like the frequency changed. He said he could feel it in his chest, like standing next to a subwoofer. And then he heard something moving in the undergrowth, not an animal. Nothing with legs moved through that undergrowth without making the sound of branches and ferns being pushed aside. This sound was smooth, continuous, like something being dragged, or like something that didn't need to step over obstacles because obstacles moved out of its way. Did he see it? He ran. Broke Rule 3, you're not supposed to run. But he was past rational decision-making. He said the sound followed him, kept pace with him exactly, not faster, not slower. Whatever it was, it matched his speed precisely, which meant it was choosing to stay that distance rather than closing the gap. Dale put the truck in drive and pulled onto the service road. Paul transferred to Mount Rainier 3 weeks later. Wouldn't talk about Section 14 after that. I wrote to him once, years later. The letter came back unopened. We drove back to the station in silence. I had 100 questions, but something about the quality of the silence, not threatening, but full, weighted with 22 years of accumulated knowledge that Dale was parceling out in doses he judged I could absorb, told me that today's dose was finished. That evening, I sat in my quarters at the ranger station and took out the folded piece of paper. I read the rules again. 7 rules, 7 boundaries between normal and whatever Section 14 was. I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. At the bottom of the paper, below Rule 7, in handwriting that was different from any of the other entries, shaky, uneven, written with what looked like significant pressure on the pen, there was an 8th line. It wasn't numbered. It wasn't formatted like the others. It was a single sentence, and it had been written and then partially scratched out and then written again next to the scratched version, as if the author couldn't decide whether to include it. It said, "They know when you've read this." I put the paper down. I looked at the window. Outside, the rainforest was darkening, the last gray light of a Pacific Northwest evening filtering through the trees. Everything looked normal. The moss, the ferns, the massive trunks of spruce and cedar standing where they'd stood for centuries. But I was listening now, in a way I hadn't been before, listening for what wasn't there. And somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, or maybe just below it, in the register where sound becomes vibration and vibration becomes feeling, I thought I heard something. Not a voice, not a sound, a pressure, like the forest was listening back. I didn't sleep well that night, not because of anything I could point to. No sounds outside, no shadows at the window, no nightmares. I just lay in my bunk with my eyes open and felt the weight of the forest around the station, 4 walls and a roof, and beyond that, miles of living wood in every direction. I'd slept in ranger stations my entire career. I'd never been aware of the trees the way I was that night, not as scenery, not as ecology, as presence. May arrived. The days got longer, the rain didn't stop, and I fell deeper into the work. Dale and I continued our Thursday patrols. We encountered no new bleeding events, and I began to wonder, with the stubborn, self-preserving optimism of someone who needs to believe in a manageable world, whether what I'd seen was an isolated phenomenon. Rare, containable, something that happened once every few years and could be managed by following the protocols and keeping your distance. Dale didn't discourage this thinking. He let me have it. I think he understood that I needed to build my own floor before he could show me what was underneath it. The thing that broke the floor was a hiker named Christine Avery. It was the second week of May, a Saturday. The park was busier now, spring visitors filling the campgrounds, day hikers on the Keynote Loop Trail, a few backpackers heading into the backcountry with permits and optimism. I was working the front country that day, doing trail checks, answering visitor questions, the routine public-facing work that makes up most of a ranger's actual job. Around 2 in the afternoon, a woman came into the visitor center. She was in her mid-40s, well-equipped, good boots, proper rain gear, a day pack that looked like it had seen real use. She wasn't a tourist who'd wandered off a paved path. She knew what she was doing in the woods. She asked to speak with a ranger. Terry pointed her to me. Christine Avery told me she'd been hiking a route along the North Fork that morning when she'd gone off trail to photograph a nurse log, one of those fallen giants that becomes a nursery for dozens of new trees growing from its decaying body. Standard nature photography. She'd found a good angle, taken her shots, and started back toward the trail. But she'd gotten turned around. The undergrowth was thick, the trail wasn't visible, and her GPS was giving her readings that didn't match her map. She'd walked for about 20 minutes before she realized she was going deeper into the forest rather than back toward the trail. That happens, I said. The canopy can interfere with GPS signals, and the undergrowth all looks... I know, she said. I've been hiking the Olympics for 15 years. I don't get lost. But I'm telling you, my compass was wrong. It was pointing south when I was facing north. I checked it 3 times. I felt a small, cold contraction in my stomach. Where exactly were you? She showed me on the map. Her finger traced a path that led directly into the northern boundary of Section 14. How far in did you go? I don't know. Maybe a quarter mile past where the trail should have been. That's when I noticed the trees were different. Different how? Christine Avery was not a person who frightened easily. I could see that. She had the steady, self-contained manner of someone who'd spent years alone in wild places and was comfortable with solitude and uncertainty. But when she described what she'd seen, her hands, resting flat on the visitor center counter, pressed down harder as if she was anchoring herself. They were bleeding, she said. 4 or 5 of them, big ones, spruce, cedar. They had wounds, not fresh, not like something had just cut them. Old wounds, partially healed, but they were seeping this red fluid, like the wounds had reopened, and the smell, she stopped, swallowed. It smelled like iron, like a nosebleed. What did you do? I took a photo, then my phone died. Full battery, but it just went black. And then I heard something. I waited. A voice, she said. A woman's voice. Calling my name. The cold in my stomach spread. Your name specifically? Christine, clear as day, coming from deeper in from the direction I'd been walking. And it sounded... She pressed her hands harder against the counter. It sounded like my mother. My mother's been dead for 6 years, but it was her voice, the exact intonation, the way she'd say my name when I was a kid and dinner was ready, that specific music. Rule 4. A sound resembling a human voice. Do not respond. Do not investigate. Did you answer it? No. I turned around and walked out. It took me 45 minutes to find the trail. My compass started working again once I was clear of that section. My phone turned back on about 10 minutes later. The photo was gone. The entire camera roll from that morning was empty. I logged her report under code RT-14, just as the protocols required. Christine watched me write the code and asked what it meant. I told her it was a standard classification for unusual wildlife or environmental reports. She looked at me for a long time. You know what's in there, she said, not a question. I know the area can be disorienting, I said. Compass anomalies happen near certain mineral deposits. The acoustics in dense canopy can... Ranger Kelly. Her voice was quiet and firm. That wasn't an acoustic phenomenon. That was my mother's voice. My dead mother's voice. Something in those woods knew my name and knew what she sounded like. I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm asking you to acknowledge that you know. I couldn't. Rule 7 was explicit. Don't discuss Section 14 protocols with civilians. I'd recommend staying on the marked trails, I said. That section of the park isn't maintained and the terrain is difficult. If you experienced compass interference, it's best to avoid the area. Christine Avery picked up her pack. She looked at me with an expression I still think about. Not anger, not fear, but a profound, exhausted recognition. The look of someone who's just confirmed that the people in charge know about the danger and have chosen to manage it rather than explain it. You're going to lose someone in there, she said. Someone who doesn't know your rules. She left. I never saw her again. That evening, I told Dale about the encounter. He listened without interrupting, making notes in his leather journal. When I finished, he asked me one question. The voice she heard, it called her by name? Yes. Dale closed the journal, set his pen down with the precision of someone placing a weapon on safe. It's never done that before, he said. Not with a civilian, not with someone who wasn't staff. It's used voices before. Hikers have reported crying, calling, sounds that could be human, but a specific name, a specific person's voice, a dead person's voice. He was quiet for a long time. It's learning. That sentence sat in the air between us like something with weight. Dale stared at the wall of the station, at the topographic map pinned there with the boundaries of Section 14 marked in faded red pen, and I watched the implications move behind his eyes. The rules are out of date, he said. We need a new one. He pulled the folded paper from his breast pocket and smoothed it on the desk. He uncapped a pen. At the bottom, below the scratched out line about them, knowing when you've read this, Dale wrote in his careful, steady hand. Rule 8. If the voice uses a specific name or identifies itself as a known individual, living or dead, the encounter should be classified as a targeted event. Exit Section 14 immediately. Do not enter again for 7 days. Report to the senior ranger. He wrote the date next to it, folded the paper, put it back in his pocket. 7 days? I asked. 72 hours isn't enough if it's targeting specifically. It needs longer to lose interest, or to forget, whichever it is. It was the first time I understood that the rules weren't a finished document. They were a living record of everything the forest had taught the people who watched it, written in the only language the institution allowed, protocol. And the forest was still teaching. June. The days stretched long, sunset not arriving until after 9. The summer staff arrived, seasonal rangers, trail workers, campground hosts. None of them were briefed on Section 14. Dale and I handled that section alone. I'd stopped measuring temperatures. Dale was right. The data confirmed the anomaly without explaining it, and at a certain point, confirmation without explanation becomes its own kind of torment. Instead, I focused on the patrols, on learning the specific geography of Section 14 so thoroughly that I could navigate it blind if I had to. I memorized every reference tree, every drainage, every subtle shift in the moss that marked the boundary. And I listened. Not for anything specific, just listened. The way Dale listened, with his whole body, the way prey animals listen, not for a particular sound, but for the absence of sounds that should be present. In late June, I entered Section 14 alone for the first time. Dale had a medical appointment in Aberdeen, a 2-hour drive each way, and a report had come in from a trail crew working the North Fork about a large tree down across a backcountry access route. The description matched an area just inside the southeastern boundary of Section 14, near the river bend. Protocol said I shouldn't enter alone outside of the November to February window, but Rule 6 specified winter months. It was June, long days, full light, and the downed tree was just inside the boundary. I could assess it from barely within Section 14 and step back out in minutes. I told myself these things as I parked at the turnout and walked through the gap in the undergrowth. I told myself the same things Dale had probably told himself 100 times over 22 years. The rational justifications that let you do the job you can't walk away from. Inside Section 14, the temperature dropped. The silence settled. The canopy closed above me like a living ceiling, filtering the June light into something green and dim and subaqueous. I walked the route I'd memorized, southeast toward the river bend, checking my watch every few minutes. I found the downed tree after 15 minutes. A massive Sitka spruce, easily 250 years old, toppled across the access route with its root ball partially exposed, a wall of soil and roots and rock torn from the earth when the tree fell. The root ball was 12 feet across and still held its shape, a vertical disc of tangled wood and dark earth. Rule 5. Do not approach the root ball. I stayed back, 20 feet. I assessed the situation from distance. The tree was too large to move without heavy equipment, and rerouting the access path would require cutting new trail through dense undergrowth. This was a job for a crew, with planning, and it wasn't going to happen today. I pulled out my notebook to sketch the situation and draft a report for the district office. That's when I heard it. Not a voice. A sound, low, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the exposed root ball. A sound like breathing. Deep, slow, steady. Inhale, exhale, with a wet quality to it, like air moving through fluid. I stood very still. My pen stopped moving. I listened with everything I had, the way Dale had taught me to listen, not with my ears, but with my nervous system, that animal part of the brain that predates language and logic and knows things that the rational mind refuses to accept. The breathing continued. It was coming from the earth, from the hole the roots had left when the tree fell, a cavity in the forest floor, dark with soil and groundwater, and from somewhere inside it, something was breathing. I looked at the root ball, at the tangle of roots, some of them as thick as my arm, ripped from the ground and now suspended in the air. They were wet. They were always wet here. But in the gray-green light, I could see that some of the roots were darker than others, slick with something that wasn't rain or groundwater. Red, dark red, running along the roots in thin streams, dripping from the torn ends where they'd separated from the earth, collecting in the moss below. The tree had bled when it fell. The roots were still bleeding, and the hole in the ground was breathing. I don't know how long I stood there. My watch said 4 minutes. It felt like 40. The breathing didn't change. Same rhythm, same depth, same wet resonance, patient, steady, like something that had been breathing for a very long time and would continue long after I left. Then the breathing paused. The silence that followed was the deepest silence I have ever experienced, deeper than the selective quiet of Section 14. This was the silence of something listening, something that had detected my presence and was now oriented toward me with the full weight of its attention. I felt it, not heard it, felt it. A pressure on my skin, on my eyes, on the inside of my chest, the sensation of being perceived by something so large and so old that your own existence becomes trivially, terrifyingly small. I left. Steady pace, most direct route, didn't run. When I crossed the boundary, I stopped and put my hands on my knees and breathed. My legs were shaking, not from exertion, from the effort of not running. Every step I'd taken away from that root ball had been an act of will that cost me something I don't know how to name. Back at the station, I sat at Dale's desk and pulled out the folded paper. I read the rules. I read the 8th rule Dale had added, and then I picked up a pen and added a 9th. Rule 9. If a fallen tree has exposed a cavity in the ground within Section 14, do not approach. Do not look into the cavity. If sounds emanate from the cavity, leave immediately. The root systems are connected. What is below the ground is not separate from what is above it. I wrote it because I understood something that the previous rules hadn't articulated. The trees weren't the phenomenon. They were the visible part of it. The bark, the trunks, the branches, that was the surface, like the dorsal fin of something vast moving beneath the water. The real body was underground, in the root networks, in the soil, in whatever substrate the forest of Section 14 had grown from and into and around. The trees bled because they were part of something that was alive in a way that no tree should be alive. And when one fell and exposed the roots, you weren't looking at a root ball. You were looking at a wound in something that went deeper than I wanted to imagine. Dale came back from his appointment the next day. He read Rule 9. He read it twice. Then he looked at me with those gray eyes and nodded once slowly. You heard it. I heard it breathing. Yes. He put the paper back in his pocket. Now you know why I stayed. And I did. Because now I was the second person who knew, and leaving would mean leaving someone alone with that knowledge, or worse, leaving no one at all. The forest would still be here. Section 14 would still be here. The thing beneath the trees would still be breathing. And someone had to understand that, had to carry the protocols and teach the next ranger and make sure the rules kept growing as the thing beneath the roots kept testing new ways to reach us. Dale retired in September. 22 years. He packed a single duffel bag and a box of journals and stood at the station door looking out at the tree line like a man saying goodbye to something that was both his captor and his purpose. You'll want to leave, he told me. Some mornings you'll sit in your truck with the engine running and the road pointing away and you'll think about just driving. Do the job anyway. Check the trees, walk the section, follow the rules, add new ones when you need to. He handed me the folded paper. It was even softer now, even more worn. 9 rules in 6 different handwritings spanning decades. One more thing, he said. It knows your name now. It's known it since the day you read that paper. It's patient, Frederick. It can wait longer than you can be careful. So be careful every single day and understand that every single day will not be enough and do it anyway. He drove away. I haven't heard from him since. I wrote to him once. The letter didn't come back, but he didn't reply. I stayed for 9 more years after Dale left. I trained 4 rangers during that time. 3 of them transferred out within 2 years. 2 by choice, 1 by medical leave after an encounter in Section 14 that I'm not going to describe here because the details belong to him, not to me. The 4th, a woman named Rachel Osei, stayed for 5 years and is still there now as far as I know. She's the one carrying the paper. I added 2 more rules during my tenure, bringing the total to 11. I won't share all of them. Some are specific enough that they could lead someone to Section 14, and the last thing that place needs is curiosity. But I'll tell you this. In my 11th year, in the middle of February, during the deepest part of the winter, when the rainforest is as dark and saturated as it ever gets, I was lying in my bunk at the station at 2 in the morning, and I heard a voice outside my window. It was my father's voice. My father died when I was 19. Heart attack. Sudden. I was at school 200 miles away, and by the time I got to the hospital, he was already gone. I never said goodbye. It's the central wound of my life, the unfinished conversation, the things I should have said, the look on his face the last time I saw him alive when I was leaving for campus and he was standing in the driveway and he said, "Drive safe, Freddie." And I said, "Yeah, Dad," without looking back. That voice outside my window said, "Drive safe, Freddie." Exactly. The cadence, the warmth, the slight gravel in his throat from 30 years of coffee and not enough water. It was him. It was so perfectly, specifically, devastatingly him that my hand was on the door handle before I understood what was happening. I stood at the door, my hand on the knob. The metal was cold. Outside, the voice said it again. "Drive safe, Freddie." And then, softer, the way he'd say things when he thought I wasn't listening. "I'm proud of you, bud." He never said that to me. Said that to, not those words, not in life. But it was something I'd imagined him saying 1,000 times, something I'd needed to hear for 20 years. And the thing outside my window, the thing that had learned my name from a folded piece of paper that had been breathing in the soil beneath Section 14 since before anyone thought to write the rules, it knew. It knew exactly what I needed to hear, and it offered it to me through a closed door in the middle of a February night. I didn't open the door. I stood there for an hour, my hand on the knob, listening to my dead father's voice say the things I'd spent half my life wishing he'd said. And I did not open the door. That's not courage. That's not strength. That's the rules. The rules held me when my own grief would have walked me into the dark. Whoever wrote Rule 4, whoever learned the hard way that you don't answer the voices, they saved my life that night from a distance of decades. That's what the protocols are. They're the accumulated survival of everyone who came before, written down and passed hand to hand, ranger to ranger, so that the next person doesn't have to learn by dying. I left the service 14 months ago. Not because I stopped being able to do the job, because I started to realize that I was becoming Dale. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the sense of being hollowed out by vigilance. I'd wake up and check the tree line before I checked the time. I'd hear a bird outside my window, and my first thought wasn't, "That's a varied thrush." It was, "Is that really a varied thrush?" The suspicion had colonized everything. Couldn't hear my own name without flinching. Rachel was ready. She'd learned the section. She'd written her own rules. She had the paper, and she had the steadiness that the job demands, that ability to stand in the presence of something that shouldn't exist and do your work anyway. I drove out of Kino on a Tuesday morning. It was raining. Of course it was raining. I didn't look back, but I felt it. That pressure, that attention, like the forest was watching me leave and taking note of which direction I turned. I live in Bend, Oregon now, east side of the Cascades, dry. The trees here are ponderosa pines, tall, sparse, sun-loving. They smell like vanilla and butterscotch when the sun warms their bark. They're nothing like the dense, wet, ancient giants of the Quinault. I still work outdoors. I do trail consulting for the Forest Service and some private land trusts. I'm good at it. I know trails. I know forests. I know where to put a switchback and how to grade a drainage crossing and when to reroute instead of repair. I'm useful in a way that doesn't require me to carry a folded piece of paper in my breast pocket. But I think about Section 14 every day. I check in with Rachel when she'll let me. She's careful with what she shares. She's figured out, as I figured out, as Dale figured out, that talking about it too much pulls it closer. That attention flows in both directions. I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'm done. Last March, I was hiking a trail near the Deschutes River, about 6 miles from my apartment. Pine forest, dry, sunny, 250 miles from Olympic National Park. I stopped to rest on a log, and I noticed that the tree next to me, a ponderosa, maybe 100 years old, had a wound in its bark. An old wound. Woodpecker damage, probably, or a branch that had broken in a storm. The wound was dry, normal, pale wood, darkened with age. Exactly what you'd expect, but around the edges, just barely visible, there was a stain, a faint discoloration that could have been fungal, could have been mineral deposits from rainwater, could have been a dozen things. It was reddish. I stared at it for a long time. Then I stood up and walked home and called Rachel. She picked up on the first ring, which she never does. "I know," she said before I could speak. "The boundary markers are wrong. It's spreading, Frederick. 1/2 mile past the old perimeter since you left." I asked her if the rules were holding. "For now," she said. "For now." I hung up. I sat in my apartment in Bend, Oregon, 250 miles from the Quinault rainforest, and I looked at the ponderosa pines outside my window. Sun-loving trees, dry bark, vanilla and butterscotch. And I listened. If you're planning to visit Olympic National Park, and you should, it's one of the most extraordinary places on the continent, stay on the marked trails, especially in the Quinault district, especially near the North Fork Road. If your compass starts acting strange, turn around. If the birds go quiet, turn around. If you hear a voice that sounds like someone you love, someone you've lost, someone who knows exactly what you need to hear, turn around. Don't answer. Don't investigate. Don't look for the source. Some places are not ours. Some things are older than our ability to understand them and larger than our ability to contain them. The best we can do is draw a line, write down the rules, and pass the paper to the next person. The line is moving, but it's holding for now.